I'd like all of us to think about
science and its methods and tools,
space-time,
the nature of human consciousness,
artificial intelligence,
incredibly realistic humanoid robots,
the new technology for gene editing,
the battle against climate change,
future civilization, Mars, Moon, wherever we're going to go.
A laser highway of laser beams shooting the consciousness of aliens at the speed of light.
What? Dude.
Get smarter faster with new Big Think videos daily from the world's most brilliant minds.
Welcome everyone to the Big Think Live webinar. Today's topic is COVID-19 in prison, the crisis behind bars. I am Peter Hopkins, the president and co-founder of Big Think, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I just want to say we were having a couple of technical difficulties which delayed the start of today's webinar, so bear with us. And if anyone has recommendations for good live stream broadcasting platforms, just put them in the comments of whatever platform you're joining us through, YouTube, Facebook, we could use it. Anyway, without further ado, our guest today is Shaka Senghor. Shaka is the president of Shaka Senghor, Inc. and the New York Times bestselling author of Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in American Prison. He is a content creator and consultant whose focus is shifting societal narratives through storytelling and developing workshops with high entertainment value and deep social impact. He is the founder of the soon-to-be launched Redeemed Soul Initiative, which we will discuss a bit later in the conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Shaka. Shaka, thank you so much for joining us.
Excited to be here.
Now, just a couple of housekeeping notes for the audience. If you are new to Big Think Live, we are going to spend about 45 minutes with Shaka today. Then there will be an exclusive segment at the end just for our subscribers to our Edge learning platform, where Shaka will walk us through a lesson drawn from his experience in solitary confinement and how he dealt with that for 4 years. Wherever you're joining us, YouTube, Facebook, the Big Think platforms, please feel free to add your questions to the comment section. We've got editors who are watching all the platforms and will be feeding questions in. And around halfway through the session, we'll segue over to audience questions exclusively. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's dive right in. Shaka, in preparing for this discussion, I stumbled on some really shocking statistics. The sort of most bold-faced of which is that as of yesterday, 8 of the 10 largest, fastest growing hotspots, COVID-19 hotspots in the United States are prisons. And the other 2 are, one is the meatpacking plant in South Dakota that's received so much attention, and the other is the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which we've also seen. But the other 8 are all prisons in different states. Can you give us a sense of what is going on right now in America's prisons as it relates to this pandemic?
I think we're just sitting on a humanitarian crisis powder keg right now that's going to really blow up in our face if we don't really step back and say, okay, how do we help get as many people out of there as possible? And how do we make sure that the people who are there get the resources that they need to be able to protect themselves? One of those prisons on the list, Lakeland Correctional Facility in Michigan, is a prison that I was actually at, and that currently 3 other men I grew up with prison are currently at. And so I'm taking calls from them every day as they're talking about what their experience is. In fact, I just got a letter today from one of my guys on the inside, just expressing what he's feeling right now, you know? So very scary times. I think this is an opportunity for us to either be courageous or cowardly, and it's really up to us to choose. But if we sit back and we just allow this virus to continue to spread in that environment, we're going to have thousands and thousands of deaths on our hands that at some point we're going to have to step back and look at ourselves and say, why did we allow this to happen?
We actually have audio from a couple of conversations you've had with friends who are currently incarcerated. Let's tee up one of them, the first one, and we'll listen to it. And afterwards, I want you to give context about who this person is, what what you heard, what their concerns are.
Absolutely.
You got 1,400 guys here. You got the largest population of lifers in the state of Michigan at this place. We got like 600 to 700 lifers here. We have the most elderly population in the prison.
Wow.
So that's going to make us particularly vulnerable to guys catching COVID because you got a lot of guys with underlying health conditions. We got 1,300 guys filing into and outside of the chow hall, handling 2 doors going in and 2 doors going out. Obviously, they can't sanitize them 1,400 times, so we already know that COVID will last on metal surfaces for 3 days.
Right.
So you got the transmission possibility of that, just the door handles alone. We're breathing the same air. You know, if the virus can stay in the air for 3 hours, it takes 2 hours to run every chow line. We're still sitting 4 people at a table, less than 2 feet apart, when the CDC guidelines call for 6 feet of social distancing.
Wow. So he pretty much summed it all up. Tell us about him. Tell us about what you've been hearing.
Yeah, so that's a friend of mine I've known since 1991. When I first entered prison, at that point he had already had about 3 or 4 years in. His name is, we call him JR. He's been in prison since he's been 15. And he actually worked on overturning the juvenile lifers with parole sentences in Michigan. And unfortunately, retroactively, he didn't benefit from it. So he should have been out of prison some years ago. So he has over 30 years in prison, been in since he's been 15. Very brilliant, very, thoughtful writer, speaker. And that was a call from a couple of weeks ago. The circumstance in there have got even worse since that time. They have, stopped running the child lines and they're bringing the food to the units. But, the numbers there, Lakeland Correctional Facility is on that list of top 10 hotspots. And so the numbers there are unbelievable. And that's the current environment that JR and many of my other friends exist in.
Help paint a picture for people. I mean, obviously, everyone has an image of what life in prison is like. But as it relates to the things that we have to be doing, wearing masks, washing our hands, social distancing, paint a picture for us about what can, even feasibly be done in that sort of environment.
So it's very tough. The reality is that most people in our society really don't understand how our systems are structured. So imagine, if you will, every state has its own prison system. And then within that prison system, there are security levels. So no prison looks exactly alike. So at the lower levels, which is where, Lakeland is, it's like medium security, there are cubicles. There's not even, cells. There are, 6 to 8 men, in some cases up to 30 men in a cubicle setting, which means that their bunk beds are in an open air environment and they're less than, 4 feet apart. You can basically reach out of your bed and touch the next person's bed. Or, if and all of them are bunk beds. So that means that there's somebody beneath you and then somebody typically on each side of you with maybe a locker in between. And then you're talking about, all the things that we're not considering, like showers. When you go to the showers, one of the prisons that I got a call from, it's 96 guys to the tier that's on each wing. And then there's 4 showers. And the 4 showers are in 2 shower stalls. So there's 2 showers side by side on one floor, 2 showers side by side on the bottom floor. And then there's a communal bathroom. So they're all sharing the same sinks, which is typically in most units is 4 sinks for like almost every 100 guys. So it's 25 guys a sink basically. And the same thing with toilets. So it's just almost impossible to keep those environments sanitized and germ and bacteria free. I can't hear. I couldn't hear anything you said, but I'll just keep talking until we get the voice back.
Oh, I'm on mute. Sorry. No one could hear me. Apologies. I was just saying we're going to queue up another audio clip of you in conversation with a friend incarcerated. Can we get clip number 2 going?
Because all of a sudden now, since we started putting this intel out there, it's restricted. So then just yesterday they come through and they did some superficial testing on him. Okay, we're gonna test your blood pressure to temperature. But they using the same little blood pressure tools, the devices that they got. They start from bump 1 and putting that same device on everybody's hand, knowing that this unit where we're at is one of the most effective units on this compound. I'm in ground 0 right now. And F unit, you know what I'm saying? It's horrible up here.
Wow.
So what we're hearing there is that the response is maybe worse than the problem, that it's exacerbating what's going on. What sense do you have of the interventions being taken, and what's working and what may be totally counterproductive?
Well, the reality is that what's happening in prison reflects the reality of the world, that we were just not prepared for a pandemic at any rate. And so with that being the reality, you can imagine that the prisons are grossly under-resourced. My heart goes out to the healthcare workers in that environment. In one prison is 10 nurses to 1,200 men. So, the reality is there's just not a lot of resources inside. And so we've been kind of offsetting that by doing what we can out here to raise, funds to actually, get the resources on the inside. And so that's the reality of what's going on. We just don't have the structure in place to, prepare anyone for something of this magnitude. And we're seeing it play out in real time on prison yards throughout the country. And, when you look at the way that the country, in general handled the pandemic, where everything was kind of delayed, we're trying to figure out what's happening. So that pushed everything in prison even further behind because that wasn't a priority. And now we have all these hotspots on our hands. And, it's just a really tragic situation that's happening right now.
What is the atmosphere like on the inside? What are people thinking who, like your friend who you said, should have been released by now and has, worked to change some of the laws involving his own very conviction? What's the psychology like if you're sitting in there looking at this and feeling like you're the lowest priority in a, high stakes situation?
I mean, the most difficult thing for me recently was just, I take calls mostly on Sundays because I'm usually not doing any work. And, just hearing these men that I grew up with in fear of their life and feeling like they're just trapped in an environment where they're basically just waiting on their turn to contract the virus and eventually die. And, it's frightening to think that these men have been in prison since they've been kids and they're still being held in this environment when, there's not even a likelihood that they're a threat to society. And so we're hoping that some governors can really start thinking outside of, what's politically comfortable and do the thing that's right in terms of what it means to be human.
And what specifically does that look like? What would you like the governors to do?
So compassionate releases, I think we should be thinking about, how can we better support people actually staying alive. And it's an aging population. A lot of these guys went in when they were kids. They're middle-aged men and middle-aged women now. And, we can set up some structures to get them home and, empower some of these nonprofit organizations that do reentry work to help support them in coming back to the community safe in a way that honors their humanity and doesn't just position them to just die. The idea that these men and women are sitting in here basically waiting on this virus to impact their life, is devastating. So I think the governors need to act with haste to, mitigate some of these realities.
You've actually spoken a lot about the identity that one is bestowed on somebody who's been incarcerated. How does a situation like this play into that? And maybe just talk to us a little bit about that branding and what it means to somebody who's on the inside and then ultimately gets out.
Yeah, I mean, for years, we've had this tough on crime campaign utilized by politicians to ensure that they won over the vote. And so basically what they did is they just scared people into not utilizing their critical thinking tools to really figure out what's going on. The prison system has been very clandestine. It's a great tragedy to know that at any given time there's only over 2.5 million people incarcerated. Yet society doesn't know much about the people, the actual people. They know about some of the crimes, and they know about the crimes that get, splashed across the news segments. But those things don't represent the reality of the majority of men and women in those environments. And it's time for us to really, pull that curtain back and demand that governors be transparent about what is actually happening to men and women who are coming back to society. Like over 90% of men and women who are incarcerated will return to society at some point.
What do you think, what sort of statement do you think it will send if we start seeing a mass deaths in prison and people who have gone and been convicted of nonviolent crimes, drug crimes, even some violent crimes suddenly are dying and probably are as we speak, dying en masse, almost sentenced to death for crimes that are, not ones you normally issue the death sentence for. Do you think that that's going to be a reckoning for American society?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I said this is, as my good friend Van Jones said, this is a humanitarian crisis. I personally say it's a humanitarian crisis powder keg because it's going to blow up in our face. Like we have to confront this reality. And what it's going to do is it's really going to tell us who we are as a country. And it's really sad to think that for decades and actually centuries, we've touted ourselves as a superpower, as a leader of the free world, and yet we have this opportunity to exercise a high level of leadership. And if we fail to do that, it's going to be one of those moments in history when we look back with a sense of shame. And sometimes I don't even know if we'll look back with a sense of shame. I mean, you think about the enslavement of people of African descent and, living in a government that just has yet to apologize for those atrocities. You think about the annihilation of, indigenous people on this continent, and to know that, that happened in real life, like that really happened where, genocide was basically, a reality for indigenous people. And the country has gone on and still, doesn't have the sensitivity to not even mock, those people and by eradicating the uses of, team logos and mascots that are offensive. So, I mean, we lack a level of sensitivity in terms of our humanity, and what it means to treat people of color, marginalized people, poor people, or not even poor people, people who are living in poverty, and people who have been marginalized, the way that we treat them in the country. Like, it wouldn't be shocking if we ignore this thing and thousands of people die on our watch.
Mm-hmm. What do you say to those people who say prison should be our lowest priority, especially during a crisis? That it's people have committed crimes, and that just should the resources and the attention should go to those who have not committed offenses against society.
Well, the reality is there are people in prison who haven't committed crimes. They've been accused of crimes. There's also people in prison who have been convicted of crimes that in the next couple of years may not even be considered crimes. If we just think about marijuana legislation, where at one point there were tons of people in prison for growing, selling, using marijuana, and now it's a big market primarily that benefits white men in America, and those are the facts, right? And 5 years ago, those things were illegal, and now they're legal, and so people are getting out, and some people are still languishing away, even though it's legal now. So you have to think about prison is made up of all kind of people. I don't make the designation between violent and non-violent. People are people, and the reality is, if you didn't pay child support, you can be in prison for that, or if you had a night on the town where you had too many drinks and decided to drive, you can be in prison for that. You can have a prison sentence and get released on parole or probation and have an encounter with an officer that isn't even a crime, but just that encounter can send you back to prison. So people, first of all, need to really understand that our prison systems are made up of a lot of people, but ultimately it's a responsibility issue. If you're going to incarcerate people, then you take on the responsibility of managing their health, well-being, and life. And when you fail to do that, then you yourself become criminal because you have failed in your responsibility to protect not only the people inside that community, but in the larger community when people are getting out. So, though it's our responsibility. If you're out here in society, you can socially distance. You have that freedom, and unfortunately, the men and women inside don't.
Amen. And I imagine that extends to the communities that these facilities are in too, because the people who work at the prison are going home every night, and they're in there. And I imagine there's not much more protection for a warden or officer in the facility than there are for the inmates.
Well, there's more protection for the warden because they don't have to go in the cell block, but for the officers that are working in that environment, I mean, they're putting their lives at risk, and even though I was formerly incarcerated, my sense of what it means to be human is inclusive of people who work in that environment. Like, their health is being compromised, their safety is being compromised. It's not just their health, and it's a frightening thing to know that these people are on the front lines in this environment, whether it's the nurses that work inside, the correctional officers, or counselors, and people weren't moving with the level of urgency that's required. Because the other part about it, when I keep going back to this powder keg, so there's two things that's going to happen. One is a lot of people are just going to die because they, got, COVID-19. And then the other part is, as anxiety increases and hostilities increase, then the likelihood of these environments erupting into rebellion is real. And that means that you're putting the lives of officers and nurses, as well as the men and women on the inside, at risk in a way that really isn't necessary.
Do you have a sense? Can you gauge the temperature of that, at least among the institutions that you're still involved with, where you're talking to people? Are we getting close to that in any place?
Well, the men that I've been speaking with, they've been in prison for a very long time, upwards of 30 years. And, the prison that they're at has a lot of the aging population. So it tends to be a lot calmer in those environments. So my biggest concern is in environments where, the young men and young women are younger. And, that's a whole different beast. But even the young men where they're at, that tension is there. Some of them have been taken to solitary for refusing to take the basic test because they didn't want to compromise their health. So the tensions are definitely starting to rise in there.
Talk to us a little bit about the experience of families. What is it like? I mean, you've obviously got your inmate population, but each of those people has a network around them. What is it like to be in their shoes, where they have a loved one who's in this dangerous environment? They're now, dealing with this in their own lives as well. They're quarantined, and presumably there's got to be a major economic impact that these families are probably disproportionately subject to. paint the picture there.
Yeah, I mean, the families are, they're really struggling, and it's devastating because they can't go visit. The calls are limited now, and their ability to support their loved ones is really hard. And then, of course, they don't, a lot of times they don't have anybody to turn to when things are really difficult. So I've been getting a lot of letters, in through my direct messages or, inbox on my social media accounts from family members who are really afraid that their loved ones are dying. Some people haven't heard from loved ones. And, there's some loved ones who have actually died already. So, and then they can't go, get the body and do accurate burial. So, they're impacted in ways that, is just so upsetting to the core of what it means to be, a human being with compassion and empathy. And when you think about the fright and the fear, and then I don't want to leave the victims out, because this is very complex times of people who have been victimized in a sense that now something that they may have wished they didn't have to deal with is now right back at the forefront of their thinking. So, this impacts all of us in a real way.
And you're a dad. What are your reflections on being a parent in this time? Obviously you're not still, incarcerated, you're out, but, clearly you, have been affected by that experience. How is that informing, how you're helping your son deal with this and how you look at this from the eyes of being a dad?
Yeah, I'm actually happy you asked that because being a dad is my favorite thing in the world. And I have 3 children, 2 are adults, and then I have an 8-year-old son who lives here with me in LA. And he's the light of my life. One of the things that we did early on is Mom and I, even though her and I we're not together, we still co-parent in a way that really honors our son. And so we're constantly talking about the best ways to support him right now. He's doing his classes virtually, which is cool. He's kind of self-regulated. And, I've been intentional about not forcing some weird structure on him because children are going through it as well. They have anxiety. They're missing their friends. They're missing the ability to move freely. And I'm very thoughtful about that. So we've just been getting creative. We've been spending a lot of time outside in the backyard. We've been, playing music and dancing and, creating art and just doing whatever we can to just stay connected. We've been watching sitcoms, which I haven't had the luxury to do in forever. So it's been great to just spend this time with my son, but also to not stress my life out, feeling like his days have to be super structured. And I encourage all parents to give themselves some grace and permission to just be.
Yeah, because you, from your vantage point, you would, a lot of parents are feeling this stress right now. You have a unique experience as it relates to having to maintain your stress and the stress of your experiences in relationship to your son. Elaborate a little bit more on this idea of sort of embracing the grace. I think that at least the parents I know, they're having a hard time doing that, and maybe, getting some sense of how you go about it, given all that you've gone through, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I start with just thinking about my son's emotional well-being, and I realized that the more informed he is, the better his adaptation has been. And the other part of it is just, we live in a world where if you're an entrepreneur or you work in the workforce, everything is so structured and regulated in time. It's like 8 hours, 40-hour weeks, punch in, punch out. And, that's its own strength. And so now we're in a space where there isn't much structure, and the thing is like, we're fine. It doesn't have to be. And so I highly encourage parents to intentionally disrupt the structure just to give themselves some permission to breathe. We're already doing it in some ways. We're hopping on Zoom meetings and T-shirts and jogging pants, and we're not dressing up for the office. So it's just like extending that grace to other areas of life. Some nights I'm just like, I don't feel like cooking. I'm gonna eat a bowl of cereal. It's morning time somewhere in the world, so I just been really taking this super casual approach and just not overthinking everything, and it's fine because, there's also the social media pressure where people are like, you got to come out of this as a top entrepreneur and in top shape. And the reality is you don't have to do none of those things, because we don't know when it's going to end. So control what you can control in the moment. Allow your children to be disruptive, to make noise, to break things, and understand that those are just things. We only get one shot at this thing called life. I would rather spend it in joy and bliss with my son, making noise and being a kid, than to be stressed out and trying to overregulate his anxiety or his just need to utilize his energy. So, going out for walks, I'm fortunate I have a backyard, so we walk around the backyard sometimes. I do stuff to tire him out, though, at times. We work out and, but sometimes we just lounge on the couch and just watch marathons of random stuff, animal shows and television. So I just highly encourage people to, get himself that grace.
Now we're going to move on to some audience questions, of which we have a bunch, but I want to do a little housekeeping first because there are a number of very effective organizations right now doing some valuable work, and people listening as far as what's going on in the with the pandemic and prisons. Can you talk a little bit for those who want to help out, those who want to engage in some way, contribute to this? Can you tell us about a couple of organizations that stand out to you as doing good work, and sort of what specifically they're focusing on as far as alleviating some of the pressures of the current situation?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to be able to work with some incredible organizations, both here in LA and California, and then nationally. Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which I used to be the executive director of, are some of the most incredible human beings going inside prisons. They're helping men and women come home healthy and whole. So a lot of people don't have transportation, so they're doing, this ride home program where they go pick them up, bring them gloves and masks and, a hygiene kit and things they need to just establish themselves in society. They also just raised money to get, I think it was like 30 or 40,000 bars of soap distributed to some prisons in California to make sure people can take care of just their basic hygiene. I also worked and partnered with Reform Alliance, where we were able to get 100,000 masks distributed to Rikers Island, Parsons Prison in Mississippi, and a couple of county jails in Tennessee. I'm in the process of building out a platform called Redeemed Soul that's really kind of like a communal space of all these organizations that's doing incredible work around criminal justice and reentry. And ultimately what it is kind of like a one-stop shop for donors to come and basically support whatever organization or initiative from those organizations that they care about and that they're interested in.
Terrific. Well, our first audience question dovetails perfectly with this because the audience member wants to know, for those who cannot donate, who don't have extra dollars to give, what can they do?
One of the things that I think is important is sharing the content we're producing. There's another org that I work with called #Cut50, a brilliant organization that does a lot of national policy, and they're utilizing stories to help people think about how do we support people on the inside. So I would say share our social media content. Inbox me at any of my social media accounts or send me your email so I can add you to our mailing list. And then we always need resources and just kind of hands-on people that's willing to, support some of these programs. And, shoot me an email and we'll get connected with whatever, ways to plug you in.
Another audience member asked a sort of related question to this, which is the social media point, which is on social media, this person is observing lots of negativity as relating to stories of COVID in prison, vitriolic statements, people who are expressing glee at the misfortunate outcomes. They want to know. This person wants to know, how do you make sense of this sort of inhumane outlook on the prison population and almost the sort of sadistic way that certain people and hatred, this person uses the word hatred, that is projected at that group of people.
Yeah, I mean, I get it all the time. I get like mean inboxes and things of that nature, and I've learned to recognize that hurt people. And oftentimes when people are showing up, publicly in that way, there's some type of deep hurt that's happened in their life that makes them feel the things that they feel. Sometimes they've been a victim of crime, or, they have a loved one. And so, the reality is not everybody's going to agree with my position. And I've learned to just ignore those people whenever possible and to not give them a front role in my life, So, the reality is we're always going to have people who are racist, bigoted, sexist, misogynistic, mean-spirited, and that's what makes the world go around. It's just, a fact of life. And I've learned to ignore those people when possible. Sometimes I'll engage them publicly because I think it's important for people to see why I have the views that I have, and to dismantle some of those ignorant views through facts and statistics and data is really important. So, those people are going to show up, and we just got to keep showing up. I think there's way more good people in the world than bad. Unfortunately, the bad tends to get a lot more attention. So I would just say continue to support people who are doing the work and continue to just tell these positive stories.
You're about to celebrate your 10th anniversary of getting out in June, if I'm not mistaken. How is the last 10 years? How would you characterize the last 10 years as far as the crusade to realize some meaningful criminal justice reform in this country? Where are we between the time you walked out and today?
When I walked out of prison, the narrative was punish, tough on crime. And, I've been able to work with a lot of people. I've worked with MIT Media Lab as a director's fellow to raise awareness about criminal justice. I've spoken at TED during their 30th year anniversary and introduced my story to the world in that way. I'm a writer. I wrote a book to help people understand how so many people end up in prison. But the most success has come in collaboration with other people. And I'm a big advocate of that. Like, none of us can do this alone. We've all contributed in different ways. I've worked with Van Jones through the various organizations that he's co-founded with Jessica Jackson. I worked at Cut 50 for some years on, changing policies and just being kind of like the humanizing voice of all the legislative brilliance that they were able to execute. They got the First Step Act passed. They got, Dignity for Women, had become a national campaign, and the Day of Empathy. And none of this stuff would happen without people like that. I've been able to work with Anti-Recidivism Coalition, helping people come home to an environment that nurtures the best in them and that sees their assets as opposed to their liabilities. And so it's been tremendous. I've been in a really reflective mode lately, thinking about my contribution. I mean, I got, Oprah Winfrey discussing prison and giving voice to people who come from, the background that I come from. And, I've been able to, open up at President Obama's My Brother's Keeper event and just talk about criminal justice in general. And I mean, like, it's so many people who have contributed to where we're at today. My personal life reflections is like, wow, it's been 10 years. It went by really quickly, I have way more gray in my beard than I had when I walked out. But, I'm happy to be home. I'm happy to reflect on this 10 years. I was working on a big 10-year celebration. I don't know what that's going to look like now. It'll probably be some type of online format. And, I'll likely raise some money to support some of the organizations that I care about. But, it's one of those things where, I remember not thinking I was ever getting out of prison. So to be sitting here in my home, 10 years later is, just incredible.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, seeing all that you've achieved in the last 10 years is testament in and of itself to reevaluating our approach to justice. Because if there are people like you sitting behind bars, we've done something wrong. But another question from audience members, which sort of gets to the idea of in your communication, in your storytelling, and all of these activities and projects you've undertaken to help get the word out, what have been where have you found the most success? What are the strategies that have changed people's minds where you've seen, okay, this approach, this angle helps to open up people who might have been kind of entrenched against you or not open-minded before?
Yeah, I mean, it's always complex to shift somebody's way of thinking about a thing, but I think I have a pretty high skill set and ability to tell, authentic stories. I could have been, anything in the world. I just grew up in some circumstances that didn't allow for that. I had dreams of being a doctor, and I was an honor roll scholarship student, and my life got disrupted by things that I wasn't responsible for. And eventually I started to make poor decisions that I was responsible for. And, proximity, bringing people in proximity to the stories, bringing them in prison. Like I used to do tours and where I would bring people inside prison. They would meet these incredible women and men and realize that we're defining people's whole life by one moment of their life, which is really unfair and it's really unfortunate. And so I really want to shift that so that we can see the whole person and we can recognize that any of us can go off the rails and make a poor decision or be falsely accused and don't have the resource to fight that accusation and end up in prison. So proximity is a real game changer, as the great Brian Stevenson said. You have to bring people proximate to these stories, and once you're that close to it, it's highly unlikely that you'll walk out with a negative perception of the men and women behind walls.
Mm. Well, it's so appropriate that you're calling your new initiative Redeemed Soul, because redemption really, and our idea of redemption and being the potential to be redeemed, I think needs to be revisited in our society, because we forget that that's what Christianity is at its very core, about sort of people all making mistakes, all sinning, all erring, and that we should all be given an opportunity to redeem ourselves. I'm going to segue to a couple more questions from the audience, and then I will get to our last question before we do our special segment with you on your lessons from solitary confinement. But a couple of people are asking specific questions about what interventions are being taken in prison right now. One person asked, are masks, how many people are getting masks? Is that a standard practice? Another person asks, what do you know about how sick patients within the prisons are being dealt with? Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit about what, if any, medical interventions are being taken as far as you know.
Yeah, so in some cases, masks have been getting inside. I know we got 100,000 masks inside, partnered with Reform Alliance on that. Madonna just stepped up and partnered with that same organization. There's another organization called Forward Impact who just got 50,000 masks inside. So people are starting to support and help and get soap inside. I'm currently in the process of beginning a partnership with Stanford through the Horowitz Foundation. Great friend of mine, Felicia Horowitz, she invited me to support that initiative with my wisdom and experience. And they're going to be doing testing and make sure people getting access to testing and hygiene kits possibly. We're just trying to still figure that out. But there's a ton of effort on the for people out here that's trying to support in there. But we need so much more. We need so many other people to step up. We need people to call their governors and just, speak about compassionate release. We need people to fund these organizations. This work is really hard, and there's not a lot of resources that's, to be distributed. So we need more support in that way. And, that's kind of what I've been seeing.
Now, for our final audience question, Shaka, this person is looking for you to speak to how you dealt, once you were incarcerated, also in the time that you spent in solitary confinement, how did you adjust to the lack of control and the feelings of uncertainty? This person is really equating that sense of lack of control and uncertainty to things that people in quarantine are feeling. Obviously, a little different, but there are probably real similarities. Talk about that process and talk about how you sort of began to adjust your relationship with kind of the control and certainty that you felt you knew before you got in.
Now, this is a great question. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago on Medium, and it's basically just kind of like what I learned in solitary that you can apply to what this current experience is in quarantine. And I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, this is a walk in the park. Like, this is the first time in our country that people's lives have been completely disrupted in a way that they have absolutely no control over. As a collective, obviously we all go through our things, but collectively, it's the first time that the world has been disrupted in this way. And so what I figured out the similarities was the uncertainty. So when I was in solitary, the hardest part was they would never tell me when I was getting out. And that lack of certainty made it very difficult for me to ground myself and for me to feel very, really present. And so once I was able to identify that that's what was happening, it made it easier for me to manage. So a few of the things that I recommend or suggest is, meditation. And you don't have to turn into a yogi or, a Buddhist philosopher in order to meditate. Find what works for you. You can Google different meditative practices. For me, it was really being in tune with my breathing and just allowing all those thoughts to dissipate. Writing letters. This is a great time to write letters. We have an aging population who isn't necessarily as tech savvy as other people. So I want to make sure that we're not forgetting them. So I highly recommend writing letters. I did a lot of journaling, exercise. Now, that I'm sitting home, I'm like looking up new recipes and learning new skills. I'm learning how to play, instruments right now. And so the thing is, like, there are so many things right at our fingertips that we can do. It's just having the will to do them.
Great advice. Well, I am going to thank all of our viewers for the public portion of today's webinar. I want to thank Shaka. This wraps up our public webinar for our Facebook and YouTube viewers and viewers on bigthink.com. If you enjoyed this webinar, please join us next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with Harvard Business School professor Linda Hill. And for our Big Think Edge subscribers, stick around for a few more minutes. We're going to dive a little deeper into Shaka's recommendations and get a little more insight into the various practices of self-care and self-attention that he undertook to help him get through the darkest, loneliest moments of his time on the inside. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.